Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're tackling Mpox. You sent us some really interesting stuff, a Wikipedia article, some research excerpts, and we're ready to dig in.
Let's do it.
All right, so first things first. I was looking over the Wikipedia article you sent, and it kept saying Mpox, not monkeypox. Did they, run out of ink, or is there actually a reason for the name change?
It's more about impact, actually. The WHO decided back in 2022 that monkeypox wasn't the most accurate name. It's not even primarily a monkey disease. Plus, there was this worry that the name itself was leading to stigma, unfairly linking it to certain groups of people.
Names can be surprisingly powerful, that's for sure. So Mpox is a virus, right? But what even is a virus? Are we talking like microscopic robots running wild?
Okay, that's a pretty cool image. But imagine it more like a set of instructions, but sneaky. A tiny piece of genetic code. It could be DNA or RNA hidden inside a little protective coat. On its own, it's harmless, like a blueprint just sitting there. But the second it gets inside a living cell, boom, instructions unleashed.
So it hijacks our cells, turns them into virus factories.
Exactly. It's like someone snuck a recipe into a bakery, but instead of croissants, you're suddenly churning out thousands of virus copies. And those copies go on to infect more cells, more chaos. That's how you get sick.
Okay, sneaky little things. So we know how it works inside us. But how does Mpox actually spread? Is it airborne like a cold? Do I need to avoid handshakes? Give me all the details.
It's got a few ways of getting around, actually. Direct contact with an infected animal is one way. Rodents, certain primates, even squirrels have been linked to cases, which is interesting.
Squirrels. Okay, I might be skipping the park picnic this weekend.
Probably a good call. But yeah, it's not just animals. Contact with, say, lesions or bodily fluids can also spread it. And it can spread through the air, but it's not as simple as a cold just floating by. It needs closer contact, like someone coughing near you, spreading those bigger respiratory droplets.
Gotcha. So multiple ways to spread. Now let's talk symptoms. If I get Mpox, what am I actually in for?
Well, it often starts off like a lot of illnesses, fever, headache, maybe some muscle aches, swollen lymph nodes. Then a few days later, the rash makes its grand entrance.
Oh, right, the Mpox rash. Tell me more about that. What's it like?
So it starts with these flat red bumps, and they develop into fluid-filled blisters over time. Imagine like clusters of small pimples that eventually scab over. The whole process can take a few weeks.
Oof, that sounds unpleasant, to say the least. So it's not like you suddenly break out in blisters. It's more of a slow burn.
Yeah, exactly. Now, for most people, Mpox itself is relatively mild. You might feel crummy for a few minutes, but you'll likely recover on your own.
Okay, that's somewhat reassuring. The Wikipedia article mentioned a big outbreak in 2022. Was that the first time Mpox caused this much of a stir?
Not quite. It was actually discovered back in 1958. Most cases back then were popping up in Central and West Africa. But yeah, 2022 is different. It went global and fast.
Which is where those research excerpts you said come in, right? I'm guessing they give some clues about why this particular outbreak spread internationally.
Yeah. They do shed some light on it, and it seems like it wasn't just one thing, more like a perfect storm. Increased international travel definitely played a part, along with, potentially, changes in the virus itself.
So it mutated to become more contagious.
That's one of the things researchers are exploring. And we can't forget about what was happening in the world at the time. The world was still dealing with the aftermath of COVID-19, and that might have impacted how prepared countries were for another outbreak.
Right. A lot of factors colliding. So let's break down that 2022 outbreak. Where did things first start heating up, according to the Wikipedia article?
The first cases outside of Africa popped up in May 2022. The UK, Portugal, Spain were some of the first hit, and it spread quickly from there, across continents. Definitely caught the attention of global health organizations.
Yeah, I remember those headlines. Definitely got everyone's attention. And it escalated from there, right? The WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern, PAEIC, for those in the know. But what does that even mean? Is it basically a global siren going on?
Yeah, you've got it. It's the global health equivalent of, all right, everyone, listen up. We've got a situation. It's designed to hopefully get countries to mobilize resources, share information quickly, and ideally prevent the disease from spreading even further.
So a global call to action. What happened after the PAEIC alarm was pulled?
Well, there were some wins and some, let's say, learning opportunities. Some countries really stepped up implementing public health measures, things like contact tracing, isolation. Others, not so much. There was some criticism about delays in things like testing and making sure everyone had access to vaccines.
Yeah, I vaguely remember something about vaccine shortages. or distribution being an issue.
You're remembering correctly. The availability of vaccines, especially one called Jynneos, that became a big point of contention. There were a lot of arguments that the distribution wasn't fair, that wealthier countries were getting more than their fair share.
Oof, sounds familiar. Kind of reminds me of some of the global health disparities we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic. Did the sources say anything about how high case numbers got during that time?
They did. Cases peaked in August of 2022. Over 8,600 new cases were reported in a single week. Now, that number sounds scary, and it is, but the fatality rate actually stayed relatively low, around 0.3%.
Wow, 8,600 cases in a week. That's a lot of people getting sick. But it is good to hear that the fatality rate was low. Okay, so we've got this outbreak happening.
Yeah.
What's being done to actually fight Mpox? Are we talking treatments, ways to prevent it?
Yeah, we're talking a whole range of strategies. And this is the thing. Even if you're thinking, hey, I'm not at high risk, this doesn't really apply to me, understanding how we prevent and treat Mpox, it helps you be part of the bigger conversation. You can contribute to those public health discussions in a more informed way.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to, well, public health. So what can people actually do to protect themselves?
Well, the good news is that a lot of Mpox prevention is really just common sense stuff. Things we should already be doing, honestly. Avoiding contact with infected animals is key. And yeah, that includes our cute but potentially contagious squirrel friends, unfortunately.
Right, no squirrel whispering for a while. What about contact with other people?
It's about awareness, really. Practice good hygiene, and I cannot stress this enough, wash your hands. Seriously, it's simple but effective. And think back to those respiratory droplets we talked about. If you're in close contact with someone who's coughing or sneezing, a little bit of distance can go a long way.
Solid advice all around.
Yep.
Basic hygiene, being mindful of our interactions, got it. But let's say, worst case scenario, someone does get infected, what happens then? What are the treatment options for Mpox?
Okay, so here's some good news. For most people, Mpox is kind of like that house guest who overstays their welcome but eventually leaves on their own. It usually runs its course without needing any major medical interventions. We call that self-limiting.
Okay, so no scary treatments, no hospital stays for most people.
Exactly. The focus is on supportive care, rest, fluids, maybe some over-the-counter meds to help with the uncomfortable symptoms. It's really about giving your body what it needs to do its thing heal.
Love it when our bodies have our backs. Now, we can't talk about fighting off viruses without talking about vaccines. Earlier, you mentioned that the smallpox vaccine can actually protect against Mpox. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, it's actually a really cool example of how, in science, sometimes discoverers have these unintended but awesome consequences. Remember how we completely eradicated smallpox through vaccination?
Huge victory for public health. Smallpox was terrifying.
Right. And it turns out that those same vaccines we used to wipe out smallpox, they also offer some protection against Mpox. That's because, genetically speaking, these two viruses are pretty closely related.
So it's like we accidentally got a 2-for-1 deal with that smallpox vaccine? That's amazing.
It really is. There are a couple of vaccines out there that have shown to be effective against Mpox, like Jynneos and ACAM2000. Now, just like any vaccine, they each have their own quirks, their own pros and cons. Effectiveness, side effects, whether or not they're easy to get, that can all vary, even depending on where you are in the world.
Right, the real world stuff always adds another layer. This has been fascinating. We've gone from virus basics all the way to global outbreaks and those ethical questions that always seem to pop up. Before we wrap up our Mpox deep dive, what are some key takeaways you're hoping our listeners will remember?
Good question. I think, first and foremost, remember that Mpox is such a good example of how a virus isn't just some scientific thing. It's part of our history. It's connected to our culture. And yeah, it highlights how interconnected we all are on this planet.
It's that we're all in this together, reminder, right?
Yeah.
Viruses don't respect borders.
Exactly. And second, it's one thing to learn about the science, but it's even more important to be able to use that knowledge. Apply it to your own life. Engage in those public health conversations that are so important. Whether it's making decisions about your own health or speaking up about policies, knowledge is power. It really is.
Yeah.
The more we know, right, the better equipped we are to make good decisions.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up our Mpox deep dive, we've got to talk prevention and treatment. So let's say I'm someone who wants to make sure I don't become best friends with that Mpox rash. What are my best defenses?
Well, the good news is you won't need any hazmat suits or secret potions or anything.
Oh, thank goodness.
A lot of it comes down to, and I know this sounds boring, but it's true common sense. Like with so many infectious diseases, a lot of those everyday healthy habits, they apply here too. So, avoiding contact with infected animals, obviously important. And yes, that includes those adorable but potentially contagious squirrels we talked about.
Right, so maybe put those squirrel selfies on hold for a bit.
Probably a good idea.
Yeah.
When it comes to contact with other people, awareness is key and good hygiene. Always. Washing your hands. Can't emphasize that enough. It's simple, but it really, truly works. And think back to those respiratory droplets we talked about. A little bit of distance, especially if someone's coughing or sneezing, can make a big difference.
Solid advice all around. Basic hygiene, being aware of our surroundings. Got it. But let's say despite our best efforts, we do encounter Mpox. What happens then? What are the treatment options?
Okay, so more good news. For most people, Mpox is a relatively mild illness. It's usually what we call self-limiting, meaning it kind of runs its course and you recover without needing any major medical interventions.
That is reassuring to hear. So no scary treatments or hospital stays for most people.
Exactly. Treatment usually focuses on what we call supportive care. Basically, just helping your body do what it needs to do. Rest, fluids, maybe some over-the-counter pain meds to deal with those uncomfortable symptoms. It's about making yourself comfortable while your immune system does its thing.
Gotta love it when our bodies can handle things, right? Now, while we're on the topic of helping our bodies fight off viruses, we've got to talk about vaccines. You mentioned earlier that the smallpox vaccine can actually help protect people from Mpox. Can you unpack that a bit more?
Yeah, it's actually a really cool example of how sometimes in science you have these unexpected benefits from discoveries. Like, remember how smallpox was eradicated thanks to vaccines?
Huge win for public health. Smallpox was devastating.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is that those same vaccines that wiped out smallpox, they also offer a degree of protection against Mpox. And that's because, genetically speaking, those two viruses are pretty closely related.
So it's like we accidentally got a 2-for-1 deal with the smallpox vaccine. That's incredible.
It really is. There are a couple of vaccines that have been shown to be effective against Mpox, like Jynneos and ACAM 2000. Now, like all vaccines, they each have their own characteristics, their own pros and cons, different levels of effectiveness, potential side effects, and how easily available they are can vary around the world.
Right, those logistical details can be so important. This has been eye-opening. We've gone from the nitty-gritty science to global outbreaks and even those complex ethical questions that we have to grapple with. So, as we wrap up our Mpox deep dive, what are some key takeaways you're hoping our listeners will remember?
That's a good question. I think first, remember that Mpox, it's a great example of how a virus isn't just a scientific concept. It intersects with our history, our culture, and really highlights how interconnected we all are. It's a reminder that we're all in this together, right? Viruses don't care about borders or anything like that.
Absolutely. We are all part of this one big, messy, interconnected world.
Yeah.
What else?
It's fantastic to learn about the science, but it's even more important to take that knowledge and actually use it in your own life, in those conversations about public health that are so essential. Whether it's making decisions about your own health or advocating for policies you believe in, knowledge is power, right?
Couldn't agree more. Any final words of wisdom for our listeners before we sign off?
Just this. Never stop being curious. The more we learn about the world around us, even those things we can't see, like viruses, the better equipped we are to navigate the challenges and really appreciate the wonders.
Beautifully said. A huge thank you to you for joining me on this Mpox deep dive. It's been a pleasure.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to our listeners, as always, thank you for being part of the conversation. We'll catch you next time for another fascinating deep dive into a new topic.